The door is unlocked, but there is no one left to welcome you. On a low wooden table in the center of a dim kitchen, a ceramic teacup sits empty, its bottom stained with a ring of brown dust that was once a morning brew. A calendar on the wall, yellowed by the creeping humidity of the Japanese mountains, still displays the month of October 1994. The page has not been turned in 30 years. Outside, the silence is so heavy, it feels like a physical weight pressing down on the sagging thatched roofs and the cracked pavement of streets where no footfall has echoed for a generation. This is the heartbeat of rural Japan, and it is fading into a whisper. We are told that nations are built to last, that the soil is the foundation of everything, but here the foundation is crumbling. The harvest is over, and the people have simply vanished. To understand how a village dies, you must first understand how it lived. Deep in the mist-shrouded valleys of Shikoku and the snow-heavy plains of Tohoku, there was once a rhythm to existence that felt eternal. For centuries, these agricultural hubs were the lifeblood of the empire. They were the Satoyama, the borderland between the wild mountains and the cultivated fields. Here, the landscape was a patchwork of emerald rice paddies, terraced like giant staircases climbing toward the clouds. In the 1950s, these villages were bursting with a chaotic, vibrant energy. The morning air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the rhythmic thwack of laundry being beaten by the river. Schools were overflowing, with 3 or 4 children squeezed into every wooden desk, their laughter competing with the cicadas. This was the era of the Great Harvest, a time when the land provided everything a family needed, and the community was a single, breathing organism. But as the 1960s dawned, a shadow began to stretch across the countryside. It wasn't a sudden disaster or a violent upheaval, but something far more subtle. The siren song of the city. Japan's post-war economic miracle was hungry for labor, and the glowing neon of Tokyo and Osaka promised a life far removed from the back-breaking toil of the mud and the plow. At first, it was just the youngest sons who left those who wouldn't inherit the family farm. They promised to send money home. They promised to return for the summer festivals. But as the years bled into the 1970s, the trickle became a flood. The departure of the youth was like a slow leak in a reservoir. For a long time, the water level looked the same, but the pressure was dropping. The first real cracks in the foundation appeared in the late 1970s. In one particular village in the mountains of Okayama, the local timber mill, which had provided the primary income for 40 families, fell silent in 1978. The global market had shifted, and the cedar forests that had been meticulously tended for decades were suddenly worth less than the cost of cutting them down. When the saws stopped spinning, a certain kind of hope died with them. By 1982, the small, winding railway line that connected the valley to the nearest city saw its final departure. The station master, a man who had greeted every passenger by name for 40 years, folded his uniform for the last time and locked the gate. He didn't know then that the gate would never be unlocked again. As we walk through these empty corridors of history, you notice a strange phenomenon. The decay isn't uniform. Some houses look as though the occupants just stepped out for a moment, while the house next door has been completely reclaimed by the forest, with vines snaking through the windows like the fingers of a giant. This is the marginal village, a place where more than half the population is over the age of 65. It is a community on the precipice of extinction. By the mid-1980s, the demographic shift wasn't just a statistic in a government report. It was a visible, physical rot. In 1987, a pivotal moment occurred in a small hamlet tucked away in the shadows of Mount Ishizuchi. The village's only grocery store, which had served as the informal town hall for 80 years, hung a closed sign in its window. The owner, too old to lift the heavy crates of produce, and with no children willing to take over the business, simply sat on his porch and watched the road. Without a store, The simple act of buying milk or salt became an expedition. The remaining residents, mostly widows and retired farmers, began to realize that the world was moving on without them. The infrastructure of life was being dismantled brick by brick, year by year. But the most devastating blow to the spirit of these towns always came from the same place, the school. In rural Japan, the school is the soul of the community. It is where the festivals are held, where the ancestors are honored, and where the future is cultivated. By the early 1990s, the number of children in these mountain villages had dwindled to single digits. In 1991, the Okuya Elementary School held its final graduation ceremony. There was only one student. The teachers, the principal, and the entire remaining village population gathered in the gymnasium to watch a single 12-year-old boy receive his diploma. When the ceremony ended and the boy walked out the gates to attend middle school in a distant city, the silence that followed was deafening. The school didn't just close. It took the village's heartbeat with it. Without the sound of children playing, the passage of time seemed to lose its meaning. In the years that followed, the decline accelerated. In 1995, the local post office, the last thread connecting the village to the Japanese state, reduced its hours to twice a week, before finally shuttering in 1998. When the post office closes, a town loses its address. It becomes a ghost on the map. The mail stopped coming, the buses stopped running, and the lights began to go out one by one as the elders passed away in their sleep, leaving no one behind to claim their shadows. Yet, as the people vanished, something else began to move in. Nature in Japan is not a passive observer. It is an aggressive, living force. Without the constant intervention of the farmers, the carefully manicured landscape began to transform. The rice paddies, once shimmering mirrors of water and light, turned into choked marshes of tall weeds. The hillsides, no longer grazed by livestock, were swallowed by bamboo thickets that grew with terrifying speed, cracking through stone walls and lifting the foundations of houses. By the turn of the millennium, the Vanishing had entered a new, more eerie phase. The towns were still there, the structures were intact, but they were being digested by the earth. But what happened in the early 2000s in a remote corner of the Aya Valley would redefine the tragedy of these ghost towns in a way no one could have predicted. It started with a woman returning to her childhood home after decades away, only to find that everyone she had ever known was gone. The houses were empty, the streets were deserted, and the memories were fading. To cope with the crushing loneliness of a town that had forgotten how to speak, she did something that many found beautiful and others found deeply unsettling. She began to replace the dead with something else. But to understand the true mystery of what lies in the heart of Japan's vanishing towns, we have to look closer at the things the people left behind and the strange things that have taken their place. The woman was Ayano Tsukimi. When she returned to the village of Nagoro in 2002, she found a landscape of shadows. The bustling community of her childhood, which once housed hundreds of families and a thriving local economy, had withered away to less than 30 people. The silence was an intruder that had taken up permanent residence. To fill the void left by her neighbors who had moved away or passed into the earth, she began to sow. It started with a single scarecrow, crafted in the likeness of her father, placed in a field to keep his memory alive. But soon, the project took on a life of its own. She began to recreate the entire village out of straw, cloth, and old clothes. Today, if you drive into Nagoro, you are greeted by a chilling sight. There are scarecrows everywhere. They sit at the bus stop, waiting for a bus that hasn't come in years. They lean against fences, watching over fields that no longer grow crops. In the local school, which officially closed its doors in 2012, the classrooms are filled with life-sized dolls. They sit at the desks, pens frozen in their handless arms, staring at a chalkboard where the last lesson of a decade ago is still faintly visible in white dust. There are now 10 times as many dolls in Ngoro as there are living, breathing humans. It is a monument to the absent, a silent congregation of those who were left behind. This is the new reality of rural Japan, a world where the only way to keep a town alive is to pretend the people never left. But Ngoro is just one symptom of a much larger, more systemic collapse. The rot began not in the fields, but in the halls of power and the boardrooms of Tokyo. For decades, the Japanese government focused on a policy of intense centralization. The idea was simple. If the cities thrive, the nation thrives. Huge investments were poured into urban infrastructure, while the rural prefectures were kept on a life support system of public works projects, dams that weren't needed, bridges that led to nowhere, and concrete riverbeds that scarred the natural beauty of the land. These projects provided temporary jobs, but they didn't create a future. They were a bandage on a severed limb. By the mid-2000s, even the bandage was being ripped away. The great Heisei mergers of 2005 saw thousands of small towns and villages stripped of their administrative independence. In an effort to save money, the government forced smaller municipalities to merge with larger cities. On paper, it looked efficient. In reality, it was a death sentence for local identity. When a village loses its town hall, it loses its voice. The schools were the next to go, consolidated into giant regional hubs that required children to commute for hours. By 2010, the Shutter Street phenomenon had reached a crisis point. In towns that were once famous for their bustling markets, the steel shutters of the storefronts were pulled down one by one and never raised again. The pharmacies, the barber shops, the small family-owned clinics all gone. To walk through one of these towns today is to walk through a museum of the very recent past. In a hillside village in Fukushima, abandoned not because of the nuclear disaster but because of simple attrition, there is a small community center. Inside, the slippers are still neatly lined up at the entrance, as is the custom in Japan. In the kitchen, a stack of porcelain bowls sits in the drying rack, covered in a fine layer of gray ash. You can almost hear the ghost of a conversation, the clinking of chopsticks, the sound of the evening news on a television that was unplugged in 2014. These people didn't leave in a hurry. They left because there was nothing left to stay for. The grocery store was 20 miles away. The nearest hospital had closed its emergency wing in 2015. The public bus stopped coming on weekends, then stopped coming altogether. This is the Akia problem, the plague of the ghost houses. There are currently over 8 million abandoned homes scattered across the Japanese archipelago. In some rural areas, 1 in every 3 houses is a shell. They are legal nightmares, owned by heirs who live in the city and have no interest in the land, or whose whereabouts are unknown. So, the houses sit. They rot. The heavy ceramic tiles of the roofs begin to slip, and once the rain gets in, the end is near. The tatami mats, made of woven straw, soak up the moisture and begin to sprout mold, filling the rooms with a thick, earthy scent of decay. It is the smell of a civilization being reclaimed by the soil. But the tragedy isn't just in the wood and stone, it's in the people who remain. There is a term in Japan that haunts the rural landscape, kodokushi, or the lonely death. As the young moved away, the elderly were left in a vacuum of ice. In 2018, in a fading agricultural town in Hokkaido, a man was found in his home 3 months after he had passed away. He had no family left to check on him. The only reason he was discovered was that his utility payments had bounced and the electricity company came to cut the power. This is the dark side of the Japanese Ubasut myth, the ancient story of abandoning the elderly on a mountain to die. Only now the mountain is their own living room, and the abandonment is unintended. a byproduct of a society that has moved too fast to look back. Yet, even in the face of this encroaching darkness, the remaining residents cling to their traditions with a fierce, quiet desperation. In the autumn, you might see an 80-year-old man standing alone in a vast rice field, painstakingly harvesting a small patch of grain by hand. He knows that his children won't come back to take over the farm. He knows that when he dies, the field will become a jungle within 2 seasons. But he does it anyway. He does it because the harvest is the only thing that gives the year its shape. He does it because to stop would be to admit that the story is over. There is a profound sense of mano no aware here, the Japanese concept of the pathos of things, the bittersweet realization that all things are transient. But here, the transience feels heavy. It isn't the falling of cherry blossoms, it's the collapse of a 1,000-year-old way of life. The agricultural towns were the guardians of Japan's soul, the keepers of the folklore, the festivals, and the connection to the spirits of the land. As they vanish, something fundamental is being erased from the Japanese identity. The mystery that remains is what happens when the last light goes out. In many of these towns, that moment is not decades away, it is months away. We see the vanishing in the numbers, but to feel it, you have to stand in a town square where the only sound is the flapping of a torn campaign poster from an election held in 2016. You have to look at the rust eating through the swings in a playground where no child has sat for 20 years. But as we look closer at these disappearing worlds, we begin to see that they aren't just empty. They are full of things that shouldn't be there. Strange anomalies have begun to appear in the wake of the human exodus, suggesting that the land is not merely becoming empty, it is becoming something else entirely, something that defies the logic of the modern world. In the wake of the human exodus, a new and unsettling hierarchy has begun to emerge. For centuries, the Satoyama was a boundary, a negotiated peace between the civilization of the valley and the wildness of the peak. But as the villages emptied, the border dissolved. By 2013, the reports started coming in from the fringes of Nagano and Gifu. Wild boars were no longer skulking in the shadows of the forest. They were walking down the middle of the main streets in broad daylight. In towns where the elderly were too frail to make noise, the animals grew bold. Macaques now hold court on the rusted roofs of abandoned gymnasiums, and black bears have been known to hibernate in the closets of houses where the sliding doors were left ajar. There is something profoundly haunting about seeing a creature of the deep woods perched on a floral-patterned sofa, staring out a window at a world that no longer belongs to us. It isn't just the animals that are reclaiming the land. It is the silence itself, which has become a canvas for the strange. In 2016, a photographer traveling through the abandoned hamlets of the Kii Peninsula documented a phenomenon that locals, the few who remain, speak of in hushed tones. They call them the moving houses. Because of the unstable mountain soil and the lack of maintenance, the heavy wooden structures of the traditional Minka homes begin to groan and shift. On quiet nights, you can hear the wood screaming, a slow, rhythmic buckling that sounds like the house is trying to walk. To a visitor, it feels like the village is haunted by its own architecture. And then there are the shrines. In the Japanese tradition, a shrine is not just a building. It is a residence for the kami, the spirits of the land. These spirits require attention, the ringing of a bell, the offering of rice, the sweeping of the stone path. But what happens to a god when there is no one left to pray? By 2019, it was estimated that over 20,000 Shinto shrines across Japan had been effectively abandoned. These sacred spaces, once the center of every community's spiritual life, are being swallowed by the cedar trees. The red torii gates, meant to mark the transition from the profane to the sacred, are peeling and rotting, leaning at impossible angles as if the earth itself is trying to pull the divine back into the dirt. There is a palpable sense of spiritual vacancy in these places, a feeling that the protectors of the land have packed up and followed the people into the cities, leaving the mountains to a much older, colder kind of wilderness. By 2022, the government's map of ghost towns had expanded to include areas that were once considered thriving suburbs. The rot is moving inward, from the deep mountains to the edges of the great metropolises. But the most poignant images remain in the agricultural heartland. In a small village near the coast of the Sea of Japan, there is a man named Sato, who is the final guardian of a ghost world. He is 79 years old. Every morning he walks the length of his street, stopping to bow in front of each empty house. He speaks to his neighbors, as if they are still there, wishing them a good morning, commenting on the weather. He is the last witness. He knows that when he can no longer make his walk, the history of his family, stretching back 400 years, will vanish as if it were written in water. There is a terrifying beauty in this disappearance. To watch a town be reclaimed by nature is to watch the slow-motion reversal of human history. In 2024, we are seeing the final stages of this process. In some valleys, the bamboo has grown so thick that it has completely hidden entire streets from view. If you didn't know a town was there, you would pass by it without a second thought, never guessing that beneath that wall of green lies a post office, a temple, and the rooms where thousands of lives were lived, loved, and lost. The harvest is not just over. It has been forgotten. What we are witnessing in Japan is a preview of a global future. The demographic collapse seen here is a mirror being held up to the rest of the developed world. We have spent centuries conquering the land, paving the soil, and building monuments to our own permanence. But these vanishing towns teach us a different lesson. They tell us that our presence on the earth is a fragile thing, a temporary arrangement that can be revoked at any time. The soil does not care about our borders, our economies, or our legacies. The soil only waits. As the sun sets over the abandoned paddies of Tohoku, the shadows of the mountains stretch out like long, dark fingers, reclaiming the valley floor. The light catches the glass of a broken window in a hilltop school, a single flash of gold before the world turns to gray. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell might catch the wind and ring a solitary, mournful note, a sound produced by gravity and decay rather than a human hand. The story of Japan's vanishing towns is not a story of tragedy, though there is much sadness in it. It is a story of a great exhaling. For 1,000 years, this land was forced to produce, to feed, to sustain. Now, the land is finally resting. The people have moved on to the neon and the noise, leaving the silence behind to do its work. The houses will fall, the roads will vanish, and the names of the villages will be erased from the maps. In the end, the mountains will return to what they were before we arrived, a realm of mist and memory, where the only harvest is the falling of the leaves. The teacup on the table will eventually shatter, as the floorboards give way. The calendar from 1994 will dissolve into the damp earth, and the scarecrows of Nagoro will eventually lose their straw to the nesting birds until they, too, are nothing but sticks and rags. We think of ghost towns as places where the dead remain, but these towns are something else. They are places where the living have been replaced by the absolute, unwavering presence of nature. The harvest is over. The gates are closed. And as the last light of the day flickers out over the empty fields, Japan's rural heart finally falls into a deep, uninterrupted sleep.